riots in Madison months ago. And I condemn what happened last week. But where were the swift accusations of incitement and insurrection from the other side last year? Is today's political theater a preview of what the American people can expect from single-party rule? 2 years of double standards and punishing those who voted for someone else? Madam Speaker, I hope Mr. Biden is watching today, and he will rise to the moment and call off this effort to rub salt in the wounds of millions of Americans. It is now time for all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, to turn down the temperature. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, it would be an error to suppose that men and women can be courageous every day. It would be unfair to anticipate that I or any member of this body could be a lion every day. No one is expected to be a lion day after day after day. But on this day, lions are required.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. After President Trump was not impeached, Susan Collins said he's learned a pretty big lesson. He was impeached. Then he brought his It Will Be Wild, riotous television show that he produced for one person, individual one. Intelligence reports indicate that the people he said he loves and are special are going to attack this city and attack this Capitol next week. He has not asked them not to do it. He has not told them to stand down. I most fear January 20, because I think he will try to go out with a bang and take attention away from Joe Biden.
The gentleman's time has expired, and there will be order in the House. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, statement from the President. I urge that there must be no violence, no lawbreaking, no vandalism of any kind. This is not what I stand for. It is not what America stands for. I call on all Americans to help ease tensions and calm down. Just put out that statement by the President of the United States. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the President for his words. Above the entrance to the House of Representatives is a sculpture called the Apotheosis of Democracy. It depicts allegorical peace, dressed in armor and protecting the genius of America. Last week, that peace was tragically torn apart as our U.S. Capitol was invaded for the first time since the War of 1812. A violent mob, including many with the most hostile of intentions, broke past security barriers and unleashed destruction and chaos throughout the Capitol. When it was over, 6 individuals were dead, including 2 Capitol Police officers. I've always supported the rights of citizens to peaceably assemble, but those who breached the Capitol and assaulted and killed Capitol Police should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. If their intent was to stop the constitutional requirement of this body to count electoral votes, they should be charged and prosecuted for insurrection against the government. But we are a nation of laws, not of men, and the legal standard for incitement to violence has not been met. Now, a week since the riots threatened the People's House, and a week until a new president takes office, we are rushing through an impeachment without all of the facts and evidence and without due process. We don't know what kind of information the offenders have, what evidence will come out during their trials, whether it bolsters the majority's claims or the minority's views, or whether it implicates other individuals, groups, or other officials in the attack on this hallowed institution. We just don't know. And that's why we must treat the power of impeachment and our responsibility as holders of this power with the seriousness and solemnity it deserves. Let us gather the evidence. Let us hear it in judiciary. Make an informed decision together. This action will only further fuel the political divide among our citizens and will be detrimental to the long-term efforts to unify our country. I reiterate my call from last night. Let us work together. Both President Trump and President-elect Biden have called for a peaceful transition of power. I humbly beseech my colleagues to work toward this end to unify our country and not go down this dangerous path. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, January 6th was a horrific day for our country, for our democracy. The Capitol was breached, the blood of a defender spilled, all because of a lie that the elections were stolen, a lie that has infected this nation as perniciously as the pandemic. President Trump is the source of that lie. He has perverted and betrayed his oath to defend the Constitution, attacking the foundation of our democracy by inciting his supporters to violence. He is not fit to serve and is a danger to our country while he does. I, too, pledge to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will uphold that office. I will vote to impeach President Trump. I urge my colleagues to do the same.
The gentleman from New York wishes to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
What did the Speaker know, and what did other legislative leaders know, and when did they know it? Maybe that's a rush to impeach the president, because so we'll never know what legislative leaders here knew. The FBI knew about a number of individuals that were planning a war on the Capitol, including killing police officers, and they shared the information, but nothing happened. The chief federal prosecutor in Washington stated he is pursuing conspiracy charges. The fact that IEDs were constructed in place informs me that there was pre-planning for portions of the tragic events last week. How does the president incite an attack that was pre-planned and already underway before his speech concluded? Now, I know my colleagues on the left want America to believe that the president incited a spontaneous riot that they'd like to call an insurrection, but the facts are stubborn things even if you choose to ignore them. The truth is the multiple lawless and violent events last summer, including months-long siege of a federal courthouse, burning, looting, physical violence in so-called sanctuary cities, more closely fits the definition of insurrection
the gentleman's
than
time has
anything the
expired.
president said last week.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank my friend. The American people are asking, is there any depravity too low? Is there any outrage too far? Is there any blood and violence too much to turn hearts and minds in this body? Instead of the usual justification, rationalization, and enabling and false equivalence we have to hear. This is a moment of truth, my friends. Are you on the side of chaos and the mob, or on the side of constitutional democracy and our freedom? It's that simple. That's what this vote for impeachment represents. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, could I inquire how much time each side has?
Yes, you may. The gentleman from Ohio has 25 minutes remaining.
21?
The gentleman has 25 minutes
thank
remaining.
you.
The gentleman from New York has 31 and one quarter remaining. The gentleman from Ohio.
We would reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, last week I stood in that gallery to defend this chamber against a violent mob called here by Donald Trump. I have dedicated my life to the defense of our nation, and Donald Trump is a risk to all that I love. Some of my Republican colleagues are afraid of the consequences of an impeachment vote, but this Congress sends our young men and women to war every day. I'm not asking you to storm the beaches of Normandy, but only show a fraction of the courage we ask of our troops every day. Leadership is hard. It's time to impeach.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York continues to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio.
We would reserve.
Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I heard a few minutes ago that there had been no hearings. Well, I have heard from the people of the 7th District of Illinois. They have told me what to do. They have said, impeach this president. Impeach this president and do it now. I will follow their instructions and vote yes to impeach this president. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Yeah, we continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On January 6th, terrorists attacked the United States of America. It was an attempted coup and an insurrection, but what I hope Americans understand is that it was a terrorist attack against our country. Those who came and participated must be found and prosecuted. Those who aided and abetted must be found and prosecuted. And the man who incited it, President Donald J. Trump, our greatest national security threat, must be impeached, held accountable, and never be allowed to hold office again. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio
Yeah, Madam Speaker, we reserve.
reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, future generations are not going to know the names of each member in the chamber today and voting, but they will know what we did and why. We must impeach the president because he incited a mob that attacked the Capitol of the United States, the tabernacle of our democracy. He is incapable of honoring his oath and our Constitution, and he has proven to be unfit and dangerous. I will vote to impeach this traitor to our country.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio
Reserve.
reserves his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds. The distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, today I cast my vote for the second time to impeach Donald J. Trump. He is unfit to hold office. He summons and dispatches mob to kidnap and hurt many of us. He is unfit to hold office. He summons and dispatches mob to assassinate Vice President Pence, to assassinate Speaker Pelosi. He is unfit to hold office. He summons and dispatches a mob that waved the racist Confederate flag and assaulted this Capitol, resulting in the death of 5 Americans, including 2 Capitol police officers. He is unfit to hold office.
Expired.
We must
The gentleman's time
now.
has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
No. Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in the strongest possible support for the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. When Trump made a last desperate attempt to steal the presidency, to reject the will of the people by encouraging insurrection, he became the first president to incite an attempted overthrow of the institutions he is sworn to protect. That is a horrifying first, and his actions necessitate another. He should be the first president impeached and removed from office in the history of our country. I voted to impeach him once, and I'm ready to do it again. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio.
One more, and then we'll go to you. Reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, this president took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Instead, he has chosen to betray and attack our sacred democracy. This president violated his oath. He abused the power of his office, attempted to betray the will of the American people, and incited insurrection against this very House. During the last impeachment trial, I reminded all Americans that democracy is a gift that each generation gives to the next. We must do all to protect it. For our children and our future, we must impeach him. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
The gentleman's yielding 2 minutes, is that correct?
2 minutes.
2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For 3 years, Democratic members of this body and the mainstream media lied to the American people that the Trump campaign colluded and conspired with Russia. For years, after an exhaustive investigation, it was found that there was no evidence that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. Should Democratic members of this body resign for lying to the American people repeatedly and sowing division and dissension all across America? And it was all a lie. You have brought one article of impeachment to the floor, and your one allegation alleges, and I quote, Donald John Trump engaged in high crimes and misdemeanors by inciting violence against the government of the United States. In D.C., it's a crime to, quote, intentionally or recklessly act in such a manner to cause another person to be in reasonable fear and to incite or provoke violence when there's a likelihood that such violence will ensue. There was no language in the president's speech that incited or provoked violence. In fact, at around the 18-minute mark, he stated, and quote, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. You may think that he's inciting violence because he believes there was election fraud. That's his opinion, and he's entitled to that opinion, just like all of you were entitled to your false and fraudulent opinion that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. The legal elements of incitement are based on the Supreme Court case Brandenburg v. Ohio, in which the Supreme Court set the standard for speech that could be prosecuted without violating the First Amendment. Brandenburg's speech called for violence against groups of Americans, and the court found that Brandenburg's comments were not directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. The court found that it was protected speech, and he was calling for violence. That's the current law of the land. The president didn't even mention violence last Wednesday, much less provoke or incite it. There was no crime committed, and therefore no basis for impeachment, as you need a high crime or misdemeanor for a basis. You have created a mockery out of the impeachment process, and I urge all my colleagues to stand against it and fight the latest fraud being perpetrated against the American people by the radical left.
The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve.
Yes.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Hursford.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the article of impeachment. Last Wednesday's events were not just a breach of a building, but a breach of our democracy, a threat to our republic and to who we are as Americans. Donald Trump incited insurrection against America and attempted to overturn the will of the people. We must send a clear message that committing sedition disqualifies a president from serving another day in office. I urge this body to vote for impeachment. I will. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio continues to reserve.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, last evening an 11-year-old girl joined our telephone town hall. Her question shook me to my core. She was worried about the future of this great nation, and I am too. That is why I must move forward with impeachment of this president. He has endangered this nation. He has betrayed his oath. I do this now for all of us, for our Constitution and for this republic. I do this to tell the world that this great democracy will stand and no one is above the law. And I do this for our future generations. I urge us all to unite and to vote yes on impeachment. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, history is watching and saving the receipts. Today, my colleagues across the aisle must choose which side of a very bright line they want to be recorded on for all time. On one side, lies, sedition, inciting and supporting insurrection, and domestic terrorism. The other side, your oath of office, the Constitution, democracy, decency. There is no middle ground. Today we make history forever. So choose well. A vote to impeach Donald Trump means years from now you can look your grandchildren in the eye and say, I did the right thing.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman
back.
from New York continues to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We reserve, Madam
The
Speaker.
gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, the response to political violence must always be accountability. Without accountability, more violence will follow. I learned that working at the United Nations and the State Department in conflict settings around the world, and the United States Congress is now a conflict setting. A violent mob threatened our lives in this chamber and almost succeeded, incited by the president who broadcasted lies about the outcome of our election. We must hold this president accountable. It's the only way to protect our democracy. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York continues to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm certain that every member of Congress would say that if they had been in Congress when John Lewis walked across that Edmund Pettus Bridge and the Civil Rights Act was passed, that they would have stood on the right side of history. Well, Madam Speaker, today we're going to see exactly what side of history you all are going to be on. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York continues to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Cawthorn.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, today represents a unique opportunity in our nation's history. An opportunity to put America first, to put her people first. Today is a moment for members of Congress to put aside partisan politicking and place people over power. I urge my colleagues to vote against this divisive impeachment and realize that dividing America will not save this republic. I urge my colleagues to not simply vote for what feels good. Of course it feels good for the Democrats to have a united constituency for a few more days. But I was elected to come here and vote to bring much needed help to the American people. I am willing to take the first step and extend my hand across the aisle to say, vote against impeachment. Vote in favor of a unified nation, and I will forsake partisanship and work with you, no matter who you are or what party you come from. Madam Speaker, I urge that we all vote to finally put America first. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to a new member of the House and a new member of the Judiciary Committee. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the impeachment of Donald J. Trump, the disgraced, defeated President of the United States. There must be consequences for last week's treason and sedition. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Donald Trumps in today's Republican Party aim to run for higher office, and we must send a message that no one in the United States of America is above the law. The world is watching, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York wishes to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, 1 week ago, the President of the United States incited a deadly attack on the United States Capitol while a couple of dozen members of this House and I covered ourselves in that gallery away from the Trump mob. 5 dead, including Capitol Police. If inciting an insurrection does not warrant impeachment, nothing does. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Today, I vote to uphold my oath.
The gentleman from New York wishes to reserve his time. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Excuse me, Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today to strongly object to the articles of impeachment proposed against President Trump, which make the preposterous claim that President Trump wanted or expected the riots that took place last week. He clearly said he wanted peaceful and patriotic demonstration. He did say he wanted people to fight like hell or we're not going to have a country anymore, but that's obviously standard hyperbole and was not meant to aim at physical fights. But what is offensive is what you are saying and inflammatory about the tens of thousands of peaceful protesters who were there last week, as well as the tens of millions of people they represent. You don't understand why they were here. They're scared to death we're going to go back to the days without Donald Trump of hundreds of thousands of people crossing this border every month. They're scared to death nobody's going to keep our manufacturing here. They're scared to death that nobody else will fight the cancel culture as we head towards an era when some things can't be said. They're scared to death that a majority party got here by teaming up with Black Lives Matter, a bunch of founded by Marxists and that dislike a family.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve.
Reserve.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, I rise today determined to fulfill our sacred oath to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Last week's violent insurrection on the Capitol is a stain on our democracy. A riotous mob, incited by the President, stormed these very halls, beat and murdered police officers, planted pipe bombs, and left our nation shocked and in mourning. The President's rhetoric, actions, and refusal to accept responsibilities are an imminent threat to our nation. I vote to impeach the President. I urge my colleagues to do the
The gentleman's
same.
time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
As an infant to America because they knew it's the land of democracy. It's the beacon of hope for all the world. We called it the American dream. When Donald Trump told rioters to go to the Capitol and quote unquote fight like hell, he incited an attack on the Capitol and the ideals comprising the American dream. I'm voting for impeachment because I know we're still the country my parents believed in, and I will fight like hell for it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Chair, on Wednesday the 6th, Democrats and Republicans hid on the floor, put on gas masks, and was ushered out of this room. We in this country cannot begin healing in unity without accountability and justice. The President of the United States incited a violent insurrection against Congress, you, me, and the Vice President of the United States. This cannot be ignored. Impeach now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York continues to reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, on January 6th, Donald Trump incited his white nationalist supporters to initiate an attempted coup against the heart of our democracy, the United States Capitol. This heinous act of domestic terrorism demands that Congress act to remove this president. Donald Trump has been and remains a threat to our national security and our democracy, and wholly unfit to serve as president. He and his supporters must be held accountable for inciting violence against the government of the United States. Congress must act immediately to remove this clear and present danger to our country. It's time to impeach Donald Trump again.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Taylor Greene.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I am against the impeachment effort by the Democrats. President Trump has held over 600 rallies in the last 4 years. None of them included assaulting police, destroying businesses, or burning down cities. Democrats have spent All this time endorsing and enabling violent riots that left billions in property damage and 47 dead across the United States. Democrats are on record supporting violence when it serves their cause, in their own words, on social media, on interviews, and on fundraising platforms. Act Blue. Democrats support defunding the police when it's someone else's city, someone else's home, and someone else's business. Democrats will take away everyone's guns just as long as they have guards with guns. Democrats' impeachment of President Trump today has now set the standard that they should be removed for their support of violence against the American people. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Of domestic terrorists to fight like hell and sent them to ransack this Capitol in order to prevent us from formalizing his election loss. It was a grotesque orgy of deadly white supremacism, anti-Semitism, and strongman rule. Today, we will do our duty and vote to remove the author of this horrifying chapter and banish him from public service. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, can I inquire on the time again?
The gentleman from Ohio has 20 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from New York has 21 3/4 minutes remaining.
We reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Levin.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
Madam Speaker, what each of us chooses to do today, whether we vote to hold this president to account or look the other way, will we be remembered by history, by our children and their children. The facts are clear. The evidence of Trump's insurrection overwhelming. History calls on us to do what's right rather than just politically expedient. Let us look back on this day with honor, not disgrace, knowing we were up to the oath we all took.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Luria.
The gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, the perpetrators of this heinous attack on our nation's democracy were Americans, encouraged and emboldened by President Trump because he could not accept the outcome of a free and fair election. His actions are seditious, and the president has proven that he is not fit to serve. History will look back on this moment to see who stood strong in support of American democracy. As my colleagues have said, we must come together, but our nation can
have due process and their day in court. However, there will be no investigation in the People's House into whether the allegations and that sets an extremely dangerous precedent for the future. If my Democratic colleagues were serious in their efforts to get to the truth, they would convene the House Judiciary Committee and investigate, but they are not. And so I am proud to stand before you today to defend our president from the injustices my Democratic colleagues are so giddy to pursue. I oppose this effort to impeach the president and ask all members of the House to do the same. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio wishes to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise with a heavy heart for what our nation has endured. All those who've incited an attack on these halls of freedom must never
the armed insurrectionists that stormed the Capitol. They were lied to by Republican senators and Republican congressmen and women. But they were incited to violence by one man above all else, Donald J. Trump, who tried to be the ultimate ruler of our democracy. The world is watching. Our allies are watching, and our adversaries are watching. And we must show them that no one will rule this country will be above the law. The cameras of history are rolling. We must act. We must impeach Donald J. Trump to show the world that we will stand for right.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Utah.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last Wednesday, on my third day, I realized that I can make hard and seemingly unpopular decisions. Voting to strip Electoral College votes from states is a dangerous precedent set by Democrats many years ago, perpetuated by my party as well. I heard nothing in those debates that justified such a high bar. A rushed impeachment will set a I commit to constantly being objective in all of my decision making. And as I abandon the remainder of my remarks, as I listen to this debate, it's no wonder our nation is divided. We are on an absolute race to the bottom. And I was hoping that last week we could have hit rock bottom. I commit to doing better, and I hope that we all can dig in and find a way. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you. Domestic terrorists attacked our democracy, urged on by a sitting president. These insurrectionists believe Donald Trump's lies about the stolen election. They obeyed his call to attack. They literally carried his banner while storming the Capitol. Last week's insurrection was shocking and tragic. It was a culmination of 4 years of assaults on our democracy. We must impeach this president, and the Congressional Black Caucus stands ready to join in a bipartisan message to the likes of Donald Trump.
Expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Lady from Wisconsin, Moore.
The gentlewoman from Wisconsin is recognized for 30 seconds.
While people died, he watched with glee. That is why, even though it's only 7 days before the end of his term, we have the fierce urgency of now. 7 days is too long for him to be in power. He could declassify state secrets. He could monetize national secrets to foreign adversaries, and he could even pardon.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
The person.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the. I would yield 1 minute.
Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise with great sorrow to oppose this second attempt at a baseless impeachment from my Democrat colleagues. This week's attack on the U.S. Capitol was completely unacceptable, and the people involved should be met with swift accountability. The president didn't incite a riot. The president didn't lead an insurrection, and there are no high crimes and misdemeanors requisite of an impeachment. I'm not saying the president didn't exercise poor judgment, but to criminalize political speech by blaming lawless acts on the president's rhetoric is wrong, Madam Speaker, and a very dangerous precedent. The criminals who stormed the Capitol that day acted on their own volition. They are responsible for their actions. This is an important moment, Madam Speaker, for our nation. We have the opportunity to come together and do what's right for our country. The votes are certified. President Trump has conceded. Let's focus on the future and get back to the people's business. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. Yes. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Newman.
The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to speak today. So today I stand with this body to impeach this president. I agree with my Democratic colleagues. I also agree with my Republican colleagues. Let's unite. Let's unite to address this pandemic and start by simply wearing a mask. Let's unite to bring back the economy and start by putting $2,000 checks in people's pockets. And let's unite to hold these domestic terrorists accountable and impeach this president. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, could you, how much time do I have, please?
The gentleman from New York has 18 and 1/4 minute, and the gentleman from Ohio, 17 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much. I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today at a time of historical concern. Last week on this very House floor, an attack on democracy, that symbol. But it was an attack from within this very floor. Let's be clear. Cause and effect. Accountable. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is
Thank you, Madam
recognized.
Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks.
The gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I appreciate a variety of opinions, but any accusations must go through the proper due process, whether it's election fraud or an impeachable offense. And someone who did not support the objection to certification last week, I will not support this political charade today. The rule of law and due process is vital to what our constitutional republic stands for. Congress should stop playing divisive politics and start working on delivering real good policies for the American people. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 30 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr.
The gentleman
Panetta.
from California is recognized for 30 seconds.
A week ago was the culmination of carnage caused to our country by this president. 4 years ago, he said he would stop such devastation.